The vastness of space was silent, as it always had been. But this silence was about to be broken in the most intense way. Captain Jonas Aiken stood on the command bridge of the Seraphim, a sleek human warship cloaked by cutting-edge technology that hid it from the enemy's radar. Humanity had been fighting a losing battle for years. The alien race known as the Zitharians, aided by an incredibly advanced AI, had slowly wiped out most of humanity's colonies. Now there was only one left, a small, vulnerable colony on a distant moon, the last hope for the human race. Jonas wasn't just the captain of the Seraphim. He was humanity's last defender. He knew the stakes better than anyone. But today, there was a new challenge, something that had come out of nowhere. In the center of the war room, a massive hologram flickered to life, displaying the Zitharian princess Lyra Thar, standing in her regal attire, her cold eyes staring down at the gathered human representatives. The Galactic Council meeting had just begun, and she was there, as always, to mock the human race. "I've heard a lot about your so-called human resilience," Lyra began, her voice carrying over the room. "But let's face facts. Your species is weak. You lack the biological advantages that most species in this galaxy possess. You humans can't reproduce year-round. You can't even keep up with basic survival against us." She paused, eyes glinting with arrogance. "Tell me, Captain Aiken, what makes you think you stand a chance against a species like mine?" The room went silent. Jonas didn't flinch. He had been here before, hearing the same insults. But this time, something in the air felt different. He stepped forward, locking eyes with the princess through the hologram. "You're wrong, Princess," Jonas said, his voice steady, but there was a fire burning behind his eyes. "Humans don't need to be biologically perfect to survive. We fight for something bigger than our biology. We fight for our loved ones, for our homes, for freedom." Lyra's lips curled into a smirk. "Freedom," she mocked. "How quaint. If you think love and hope can save you, then you're even more foolish than I thought." Her words were sharp, each one cutting through the air like a blade. The council members chuckled, a few exchanging glances as if they had already written off humanity's chances. Lyra knew her species was superior in every way. Advanced AI, superior technology, and a cold, calculated society that saw emotion as weakness. She believed humans were doomed, and she was eager to prove it. "I propose a challenge," Lyra said suddenly, her tone shifting from mocking to serious. "If you can prove that your species is worthy of continuing to exist, I will grant you a place in the Galactic Council. But if you fail, well, I'm sure the galaxy will be better off without you." The room went silent again. The weight of her challenge hung in the air, and all eyes turned to Jonas. He had heard of such challenges before, but never directed at his species. It was clear she thought humans didn't stand a chance. But Jonas wasn't about to let his people be written off so easily. "What do you have in mind?" Jonas asked, his voice calm, but every word carried the weight of humanity's future. Lyra's eyes gleamed as she leaned forward, her fingers tapping the holographic display. "You will face a series of trials, physical and psychological. You will prove that your species is capable of more than just survival. You will prove that you have the strength to endure in ways your biology isn't designed for. You will show me that you can fight even without the advantages we possess." Jonas couldn't help but feel a rush of anger at her words, but he knew he couldn't show it. He had to think clearly, for humanity's sake. "And if I fail?" he asked, his voice a low, measured tone. Lyra's smile grew even colder. "Then humanity will cease to exist. The Zitharian Empire will wipe your colonies from the galaxy. You will no longer be a threat to us." The stakes couldn't be higher. Jonas knew that if he accepted this challenge, he would be risking everything: his life, his crew, and the last hope for humanity. But there was no other choice. His people had been pushed to the edge, and now was the time to fight back. "Fine," Jonas said, his voice steady but with a hint of resolve that surprised even him. "We accept your challenge." Lyra's smile widened, and for a moment, There was a flicker of something, almost like respect, in her eyes. "Good," she said softly. "We begin tomorrow. Prepare yourselves, Captain. I'll be watching closely." The hologram flickered off, and the room was silent once more. Jonas turned to his crew, the weight of the challenge sinking in. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an enemy that seemed unstoppable. But one thing was clear: they were not going down without a fight. Jonas stared out into the cold expanse of space, the stars twinkling in the distance. The Seraphim was more than just a ship. It was humanity's last hope, and he would do whatever it took to prove to Lyra and the galaxy that humans were far more dangerous than anyone realized. As the crew rushed to prepare for the trials, Jonas couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The Zitharians had underestimated humanity before, and now they would learn just how wrong they were. The countdown had begun, and the silence in the war room was deafening as Captain Jonas Aiken stared at the holographic map in front of him. The challenge had been set. The Zitharians had shown their cards, and now humanity had to play theirs. Jonas knew the stakes better than anyone. They couldn't afford to lose this battle, not for their colony, not for their future. The Zitharian fleet had already begun to make its move, launching a series of strikes on the remaining human colonies. Jonas wasn't about to let this happen again. He clenched his fists, his resolve hardening with every passing second. The challenge that Princess Lyra had set wasn't just a test of strength. It was a test of survival. Humanity's survival. "Captain, we've analyzed the Zitharian tech," Lieutenant Rosa Harding said, her voice cutting through the tension. "There's one thing they don't expect. They're overconfident in their AI's ability to control everything. Their fleet, their weapons, their warships, they all depend on a central AI core located on a hidden moon in a distant sector. If we can take it out, we can cripple their entire operation." Jonas nodded slowly. The plan was risky, but it was their best chance. If they could somehow infiltrate the moon base and destroy the AI core, the Zitharians would lose their advantage. Their fleet would be rendered useless, and Lyra's threat would become a hollow one. But there was a catch. The moon base was heavily guarded, protected by elite alien soldiers and automated defenses. Getting in would be nearly impossible. "I'm sending you and your team in, Jonas," General Matthews said, his voice firm. "This is a covert mission. You'll be on your own, cloaked and undetected. You'll need to infiltrate the base, plant the charges, and get out before they even know you're there. It's our only shot at winning this." Jonas didn't hesitate. He knew what had to be done. "I'll do it," he said, his voice low but resolute. "When do we leave?" "Tonight," Matthews replied. "We've got the cloaking tech ready. You'll be off the grid until you're back. Good luck, Captain. Humanity is depending on you." The cold, lifeless expanse of space stretched out before them as Jonas and his team prepared for the mission. In the cargo hold of the Seraphim, the team was geared up, checking their weapons and equipment one last time. Jonas looked at each of his soldiers, knowing this mission could be their last. Sergeant Bonner, a grizzled veteran, slapped his weapon into place, his expression grim. "We're not just doing this for the colony, Captain. We're doing this for everyone. If we fail, it's over for humanity. No pressure, right?" Jonas gave him a sharp nod. "We're not failing. We do this right, and we hit them where it hurts." The team moved quickly, their cloaking suits activating as they prepared to board the shuttle. They couldn't afford to be detected. Every second counted. They were heading straight into enemy territory, and any mistake could cost them everything. As the shuttle exited the Seraphim, Jonas stared out into the abyss of space. The moon where the Zitharian base was located was just a speck of light in the distance. It seemed small from here, but Jonas knew that size didn't matter. The real danger lay in what awaited them on the surface. The shuttle glided toward the moon, its cloaking system rendering it invisible to enemy scanners. The crew was silent, each member lost in their thoughts as the tension grew. They had no backup, no reinforcements. This was a one-shot deal, and they had to make it count. They landed in a secluded canyon, the dark shadows of the moon's rocky surface concealing their approach. The base wasn't far now. Jonas and his team disembark, their boots crunching on the moon's icy surface as they moved toward their target. The facility was hidden deep within the mountains, shielded by advanced tech that made it nearly impossible to detect. But Jonas had learned enough about the Cytherians' weaknesses. They were overly confident in their AI, and that confidence was their greatest flaw. They approached the base under the cover of darkness, using the terrain to conceal their movements. The air was thin, making it hard to breathe, but the team was trained for this. They had done worse. As they reached the outer perimeter of the base, they stopped to assess the situation. Jonas scanned the area with his helmet's enhanced optics, searching for any signs of movement. The base seemed quiet, too quiet. That was never a good sign. Suddenly, a soft beep came from Bonner's communication device. He tapped it twice to silence it, then turned to Jonas. "Something's not right. We've got company." Jonas's heart skipped a beat. "How many?" "Can't say for sure," Bonner replied, his eyes scanning the horizon. "But I'm guessing more than we can handle." Jonas didn't wait for a response. He motioned for the team to move, signaling them to spread out and get into position. They had to act fast. If the Cytherians realized they were here, it would be all over. The team moved forward, keeping low and silent, as they approached the base's main entrance. As they reached the door, Jonas signaled for Bonner and the others to set up the explosives. They had to disable the security system before they could even get inside. But just as Bonner placed the last charge, a sudden explosion rang out from the other side of the base. The sound echoed in the quiet night, followed by the unmistakable hum of alien drones activating. "We've been compromised," Jonas shouted. "Move out, now." The team sprinted toward the entrance, guns raised, as drones flew toward them from all sides. The battle had begun. There was no turning back now. Jonas fought through the waves of drones, his heart pounding in his chest. Bonner was at his side, covering him as they moved deeper into the base. They couldn't afford to stop now. The charges had to be planted, or all of this would be for nothing. The closer they got to the core, the more intense the resistance became. The Cytherians were relentless, their robots and drones pushing harder, faster, and with more precision than Jonas had anticipated. But he and his team fought back with everything they had, knowing that the fate of humanity depended on this mission. As they neared the core, Jonas could see the flashing lights of the control center. The final push was coming. They had to finish what they started, or die trying. The battle was far from over. Jonas and his team had fought their way to the heart of the Cytherian base, but the enemy wasn't about to let them succeed that easily. They had pushed forward through waves of drones and automated defenses, but the deeper they went into the facility, the more intense the resistance became. The artificial intelligence that controlled the Cytherians was ruthless and efficient, and it was clear that it would stop at nothing to protect its creators. Jonas's heart was racing, but he knew there was no turning back now. The plan to destroy the AI core was humanity's last hope. If they could pull this off, the Cytherian war machine would be crippled, and humanity might just have a fighting chance to win the war. But if they failed, it would be the end. "Almost there," Bonner said, his voice low and focused as he covered Jonas's back. "Just a little further." Jonas didn't respond. His mind was already focused on the task ahead. The AI's main control room was located just a few hundred meters away, behind thick reinforced doors. They had to get through those doors, plant the charges on the core, and get out before the base went into full lockdown. But the deeper they went, the more the base seemed to come alive, like it was fighting back. The team moved silently through the narrow corridors, staying low to avoid detection. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every turn a potential trap. Jonas had never felt so exposed. The Cytherians knew they were here now. There was no way they wouldn't have detected the initial explosions. The pressure was mounting, and the sound of approaching footsteps made Jonas's pulse quicken. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from behind them. Jonas whirled around, his weapon raised, ready for whatever came next. But there was nothing, just the eerie silence of the base, broken only by the hum of the automated drones flying overhead. "Keep moving," Jonas ordered, his voice steady, though his heart was pounding in his chest. They continued onward, rounding another corner when they finally saw it. The door to the AI core. The security systems in front of it were more advanced than anything they'd faced so far. Jonas's mind raced as he quickly assessed the situation. They had only one shot at this. If they couldn't get through the security doors, the entire mission would fail. "We've got to bypass the security," Lieutenant Harding said, pulling out a small device from her belt. "I've been working on this for months. If it works, we'll be inside in seconds." Jonas nodded, but he knew better than to trust it completely. They were running out of time, and the longer they stayed here, the more likely they were to be caught. Harding plugged the device into the security panel and immediately began typing in a series of codes. The door's digital locks began to flicker, responding to her commands. The seconds felt like hours as they waited, the tension thick in the air. Suddenly, the door slid open with a soft hiss, and the team rushed inside. They were in. The AI core room was massive, filled with rows of towering servers and glowing, pulsing lights. At the center of it all was the heart of the Zetharian war machine, a massive floating neural network that controlled everything from the drones to the warships in the galaxy. Jonas's stomach churned as he gazed at the core. This was it, the source of the Zetharians' power. If they could destroy it, they would sever the Eye's control over the entire fleet, rendering the Zetharians vulnerable. But it wasn't going to be easy. The core was surrounded by automated defense systems, and Jonas knew that they wouldn't have long before the entire base went into lockdown. "We've got to plant the charges now," Jonas barked, snapping the team into action. Bonner, Harding, and the others spread out, moving quickly to position the explosive charges around the base of the core. Jonas kept his weapon trained on the door, waiting for the inevitable attack. The Zetharians would be on them soon, and they had no time to waste. As the team worked, Jonas couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. This wasn't just a mission. It was humanity's last stand. If they succeeded, they would strike a blow to the heart of AI supremacy and give their people a chance to fight back. If they failed, the Zetharians would crush them all. "Charges are set," Bonner said, his voice tight with urgency. "Move out," Jonas ordered. The team quickly made their way back toward the door, but just as they reached the exit, an alarm blared throughout the base. The doors slammed shut with a loud crash, and the lights flickered as the base's security system kicked into overdrive. "They know we're here," Harding shouted, her voice filled with panic. "We've been compromised." Jonas cursed under his breath. They had to get out, but the base was locking down, and the automated drones were already closing in on their position. The team fired back, pushing through the growing onslaught of enemies, but Jonas could already hear the distant sound of reinforcements arriving. They didn't have much time. "Split up," Jonas shouted, his mind working fast. "We'll meet back at the shuttle." The team scattered, firing as they went, doing their best to cover each other as they fought their way through the facility. The sound of gunfire echoed through the corridors, and Jonas's heart pounded in his chest as he pushed forward. They were so close. The team reached the exit just as the base's security system began to lock down. Jonas's pulse raced as he led the way outside, the cold moon air biting at his skin. The shuttle was waiting for them, but there was still one thing left to do. They had to destroy the core. The countdown had already started, and there was no turning back now. Jonas sprinted toward the shuttle, his heart pounding in his chest. The rest of the team was already inside, and he could hear the distant sound of approaching Zetharian soldiers. The door to the shuttle closed behind him with a soft hiss, and the engines roared to life. But just as they lifted off, Jonas turned back toward the base. The core had been destroyed, but they had no idea what the Zitharians would do next. As the shuttle sped away, Jonas couldn't help but feel the weight of what they had just done. They had struck a blow against AI supremacy. But the war was far from over. The Zitharians would retaliate, and humanity's fight was only beginning. The moment the shuttle broke free from the moon's atmosphere, Jonas felt a wave of relief wash over him. They had done it. They had destroyed the AI core. The Zitharian war machine was no longer under the control of their oppressive artificial intelligence. But there was no time to celebrate. The mission was far from over. They had only completed part of their plan. Now came the hardest part, the final assault. The Zitharian fleet was still out there, preparing to launch a full-scale attack on humanity. With their AI crippled, they would be vulnerable, but not for long. The Zitharians were notorious for their speed and adaptability. They would come up with a new plan, and fast. Humanity's best chance for victory was to take the fight directly to them. Jonas knew that the Zitharians would retaliate, and when they did, they would come with everything they had. The team was battered, exhausted, but determined. Jonas looked around at his soldiers. Bonner, still clutching his rifle, looked like he hadn't slept in days. Harding, her face covered in dust and dirt, wiped a streak of sweat from her forehead. They had been through hell, but they weren't giving up now. Not when humanity's survival depended on them. The mission wasn't just about the destruction of the AI. They had to lead an assault against the Zitharian fleet. They needed to take out their command ships, disrupt their strategy, and hit them where it hurt the most. The battle was going to be brutal, but Jonas knew this was the moment they had been preparing for. There would be no turning back. "Captain, we've got incoming," Lieutenant Harding said, her voice cutting through the tension. She was monitoring the fleet's movements on her console, her eyes scanning the data. "They're regrouping. They've activated their backup AI systems." Jonas clenched his fists. The Zitharians weren't as weak as they had hoped, but it wasn't over. Humanity had the upper hand now. The fight was just beginning. "We need to act fast," Jonas said, his voice firm. "Gather the fleet. We're going in." The next few hours were a blur of activity. The remaining human ships were being prepped for battle, and Jonas's team was briefed on their final mission, a direct assault on the Zitharian command fleet. It was a suicide mission, but it was also their best shot at winning the war. If they could destroy the command ships, they could disrupt the Zitharians' coordination, leaving them open for a full-scale human retaliation. The tension in the hangar was palpable. The air was thick with nervous energy as soldiers checked their gear and made their final preparations. Everyone knew the odds were against them. The Zitharians were fierce, and their fleet was more advanced than anything humanity had ever faced. But Jonas's resolve had only grown stronger. He wasn't going to let them win. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. As the fleet launched, Jonas's heart raced. The stars outside the ship were nothing but a blur as they broke through the atmosphere. They were headed straight for the Zitharian fleet, and there was no turning back. The battle would be won or lost in the next few hours. The Zitharians had already begun to deploy their ships, massive war vessels that dwarfed the human fleet. But humanity had something the Zitharians didn't: determination. And that made all the difference. "Captain," Bonner said, his voice steady despite the situation, "we've got heavy resistance. The Zitharians are already mobilizing." Jonas didn't hesitate. "Push forward. Stay in formation. We break through together." Arded, and there was no turning back now. Jonas sprinted toward the shuttle, his heart pounding in his chest. The rest of the team was already inside, and he could hear the distant sound of approaching Zitharian soldiers. The door to the shuttle closed behind him with a soft hiss, and the engines roared to life. But just as they lifted off, Jonas turned back toward the base. The core had been destroyed, but they had no idea what the Zitharians would do next. As the shuttle sped away, Jonas couldn't help but feel the weight of what they had just done. They had struck a blow against AI supremacy. But the war was far from over. The Zetharians would retaliate, and humanity's fight was only beginning. The moment the shuttle broke free from the moon's atmosphere, Jonas felt a wave of relief wash over him. They had done it. They had destroyed the AI core. The Zetharian war machine was no longer under the control of their oppressive artificial intelligence. But there was no time to celebrate. The mission was far from over. They had only completed part of their plan. Now came the hardest part, the final assault. The Zetharian fleet was still out there, preparing to launch a full-scale attack on humanity. With their AI crippled, they would be vulnerable, but not for long. The Zetharians were notorious for their speed and adaptability. They would come up with a new plan, and fast. Humanity's best chance for victory was to take the fight directly to them. Jonas knew that the Zetharians would retaliate, and when they did, they would come with everything they had. The team was battered, exhausted, but determined. Jonas looked around at his soldiers. Bonner, still clutching his rifle, looked like he hadn't slept in days. Harding, her face covered in dust and dirt, wiped a streak of sweat from her forehead. They had been through hell, but they weren't giving up now. Not when humanity's survival depended on them. The mission wasn't just about the destruction of the AI. They had to lead an assault against the Zetharian fleet. They needed to take out their command ships, disrupt their strategy, and hit them where it hurt the most. The battle was going to be brutal, but Jonas knew this was the moment they had been preparing for. There would be no turning back. "Captain, we've got incoming," Lieutenant Harding said, her voice cutting through the tension. She was monitoring the fleet's movements on her console, her eyes scanning the data. "They're regrouping. They've activated their backup AI systems." Jonas clenched his fists. The Zetharians weren't as weak as they had hoped, but it wasn't over. Humanity had the upper hand now. The fight was just beginning. "We need to act fast," Jonas said, his voice firm. "Gather the fleet. We're going in." The next few hours were a blur of activity. The remaining human ships were being prepped for battle, and Jonas's team was briefed on their final mission, a direct assault on the Zetharian command fleet. It was a suicide mission, but it was also their best shot at winning the war. If they could destroy the command ships, they could disrupt the Zetharians' coordination, leaving them open for a full-scale human retaliation. The tension in the hangar was palpable. The air was thick with nervous energy as soldiers checked their gear and made their final preparations. Everyone knew the odds were against them. The Zetharians were fierce, and their fleet was more advanced than anything humanity had ever faced. But Jonas's resolve had only grown stronger. He wasn't going to let them win. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. As the fleet launched, Jonas's heart raced. The stars outside the ship were nothing but a blur as they broke through the atmosphere. They were headed straight for the Zetharian fleet, and there was no turning back. The battle would be won or lost in the next few hours. The Zetharians had already begun to deploy their ships, massive war vessels that dwarfed the human fleet. But humanity had something the Zetharians didn't: determination. And that made all the difference. "Captain," Bonner said, his voice steady despite the situation, "we've got heavy resistance. The Zetharians are already mobilizing." Jonas didn't hesitate. "Push forward. Stay in formation. We break through together." The first wave of enemy ships came into view, massive, sleek, and deadly. The Zetharian vessels unleashed a barrage of laser fire as soon as they saw the human fleet. The air was filled with the sound of explosions and the bright flashes of lasers cutting through the darkness of space. Jonas gripped the controls of his ship, keeping his focus sharp as his team moved to intercept. The battle was chaos. The human fleet was smaller, but their fighters were faster and more agile. Jonas weaved through incoming fire, expertly dodging blasts and returning fire with precision. He could see the Zetharian ships taking hits, but they were relentless, pushing forward as if they were invincible. Jonas's fighter was hit, a burst of energy blasting across the hull and sending his ship into a spin. The control panel flickered as he struggled to regain control. But he wasn't about to let it end here. He slammed his hands onto the controls, stabilizing the ship and bringing it back into formation. "We're not done yet," Jonas shouted into his comms, his voice full of adrenaline. "Keep pushing, people." The battle raged on as the human ships pushed deeper into the Zitharian formation. Explosions lit up the dark expanse of space as the two fleets clashed in a fiery storm. Jonas could hear the crackle of gunfire and the sound of metal on metal as enemy ships collided and exploded. "Captain," Harding's voice broke through the static. "We've reached the Zitharian command fleet. It's massive. We need to focus on their flagship if we want to take them down." Jonas's heart pounded. The Zitharian flagship was the heart of their fleet, their command center. If they destroyed it, the rest of the ships would be thrown into disarray. The only problem was that the flagship was heavily shielded and surrounded by the most advanced defense systems the Zitharians had. "This is it, people," Jonas said, his voice determined. "We hit them where it hurts." The human fleet swarmed around the flagship, a pack of wolves attacking a single target. Jonas led the charge, diving toward the enemy ship, dodging enemy fire with the skill of a seasoned pilot. They were close now, close enough to see the massive ship's hull glowing with the energy of its shields. The Zitharian flagship returned fire with devastating force, but Jonas and his team weren't going down without a fight. With a sharp turn, Jonas dove between two larger Zitharian ships, evading the incoming lasers. His ship rattled as enemy fire came too close, but he held steady. "We've got one shot at this," Bonner shouted as the team closed in. "Now or never." Jonas's fighter rocketed toward the flagship's weak spot. He lined up the shot, holding his breath as he fired everything he had. The impact was immediate. A huge explosion ripped through the flagship's hull, and the ship began to break apart. For a moment, there was silence. Then, as the flagship crumbled, a wave of victory spread through the human fleet. The Zitharians' coordination faltered. The command fleet was losing control, and the remaining Zitharian ships began to retreat. "We did it," Harding's voice crackled over the comms. "We actually did it." Jonas couldn't help but smile as he watched the enemy fleet fall apart before him. But he knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The war was far from over, but today, humanity had struck a decisive blow against AI supremacy, and for the first time in a long while, Jonas allowed himself to believe they could win. The aftermath of their victory against the Zitharian flagship was a fleeting moment of triumph. Jonas felt his heart racing, his adrenaline still high from the battle. The enemy fleet was in disarray, but they couldn't afford to rest. Not now. Not when the Zitharians were so close to their final strike. The mission was no longer just about a single victory. It had become about the survival of humanity. Jonas had always known the stakes were high, but now, the weight of the situation pressed down on him like never before. The Zitharian forces were reeling, but their fight wasn't over. If they could regroup, if they could form another assault, humanity could still lose everything. The war had entered its final phase, and this was the heart of the battle. "We've got another problem." Lieutenant Harding's voice broke through the comms, sharp and filled with urgency. "The Zitharians are calling in reinforcements. They're pulling ships from the outer sectors." Jonas cursed under his breath. They had pushed the Zitharians to the edge, but their ability to call for reinforcements was a serious threat. The outer sectors were home to the most powerful warships in the galaxy, ships capable of turning the tide of any battle. If the reinforcements arrived, it would be a disaster for the human fleet. "Captain, we need to stop them before they regroup," Bonner said, his voice grim but resolute. "We can't let them get their reinforcements." Jonas looked out at the swirling chaos of space. The human fleet was scattered, battered but still strong. The Zitharian ships were retreating in confusion, but Jonas knew it was only temporary. The enemy would soon find its footing, and when they did, they would be unstoppable. "We'll hit them hard," Jonas said, his mind already racing through their options. Take out the reinforcements before they can reach us. The plan was dangerous, perhaps suicidal, but Jonas had no choice. It was the only way to ensure that humanity had a chance to survive. If they didn't act now, the Zitharians would regroup and crush them. The human fleet moved quickly, adjusting its formation to pursue the Zitharian reinforcements. Jonas led the charge, his fighter darting through space, dodging laser fire as he closed in on the enemy ships. The Zitharians, though disorganized, weren't going down without a fight. Their ships were heavily armed and equipped with advanced defense systems, but Jonas was determined. "Captain, we've got incoming," Harding shouted as a new wave of Zitharian ships came into view, emerging from a nearby asteroid field. They're not giving up. The battle flared back to life, lasers flashing in every direction. Jonas fired his ship's weapons with precision, watching as enemy ships exploded in clouds of fire and debris. But there were too many of them. The human fleet was outnumbered, and the Zitharians had the advantage in terms of firepower and technology. "Stay focused," Jonas barked into the comms. "We've got one chance to break them." The human fleet pushed forward, taking on the Zitharians head-on. The space around them was filled with chaos, flashes of light and deafening blasts as ships collided and exploded. Jonas weaved in and out of enemy fire, his ship rocking as shots hit its shields. His knuckles were white on the controls, his focus sharper than ever. He could hear the sounds of his crew over the comms, their voices strained but determined. "We're holding them off, Captain," Bonner shouted, his voice filled with grit. "But there's too many of them. We need more firepower." Jonas glanced at the tactical display on his screen, quickly assessing their position. The Zitharian ships were closing in on the human fleet, but there was one thing Jonas had learned in this war. Humans were relentless. They fought for survival, and that gave them a strength the Zitharians couldn't match. "We've got an opening," Jonas yelled. "Push through. We hit them now." The human fleet surged forward, cutting through the Zitharian lines like a blade. Jonas led the charge, dodging enemy fire as he locked onto the nearest Zitharian ship. His hands moved expertly, firing off shots that tore into the enemy's defenses. But there were more Zitharians, more ships closing in from all sides. "Captain, they're too strong," Harding shouted, her voice frantic. "We need to retreat." Jonas's mind raced. A retreat wasn't an option. Not now. The reinforcements were too close. If they pulled back now, the human fleet would be overwhelmed. The war would be lost. "We hold them here," Jonas barked, his voice full of resolve. "We push forward. Everyone, focus on the biggest ships. We take them out, or we die trying." The crew didn't hesitate. They pressed forward, their ships working together in perfect synchrony. The human fleet, though small, fought with everything it had, targeting the largest Zitharian warships in their path. Jonas could see the enemy fleet weakening. The Zitharians were faltering, their ships slowing as the human fighters cut through their defenses. But they weren't finished yet. Then the Zitharian fleet began to make a surprise move. Several of their ships broke off from the main formation, flying straight for the human fleet's command ship, the heart of their operation. The enemy had realized that if they could take out the human leadership, they could destroy any hope of victory. "Captain, they're going for our command ship," Bonner shouted. "Hold the line," Jonas ordered, his voice ice-cold. "We cannot lose that ship." The human fleet quickly formed a protective shield around their command ship, moving in tight formation. The Zitharian ships, desperate to break through, launched everything they had. It was a desperate fight, a final stand. Jonas could see the enemy ships closing in, their weapons charging for a devastating strike. The human fleet fought with everything it had. Explosions rocked the battlefield as both sides took hits, but the human fleet refused to back down. Jonas and his team fought side by side, their ships maneuvering with precision, blasting through the Zitharian forces. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the enemy ships broke off, their attack faltering. The human fleet had held their ground. Jonas's heart pounded as the last of the Zitharian ships retreated. They had done it. The command ship was safe, and the reinforcements had been destroyed. The human fleet had won the battle, but it had come at a cost. The scars of the fight were everywhere. Ships were damaged, and many lives had been lost. Jonas sat back in his seat, taking a deep breath. They had won this battle, but there was no time to rest. The war was far from over, but for the first time, Jonas felt a spark of hope. Humanity had fought back, and they had won. The smoke of the battlefield still lingered in the cold vacuum of space. The silence was deafening, interrupted only by the hum of damaged ships and the soft crackle of static over the comms. The human fleet had survived the final assault, but the cost of their victory was steep. Jonas sat in the cockpit of his ship, his hands resting on the controls, his mind reeling from everything that had just transpired. They had done it. They had pushed back the Zitharian forces, destroyed their reinforcements, and protected their command ship. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jonas allowed himself a moment of relief. They had won this battle. But that victory came at a high price. "Captain, we've done it." Bonner's voice broke through the silence. It was a rare moment of calm, but Jonas could hear the exhaustion in his voice. The battle had taken everything they had. "We lost a lot of good people," Harding added, her tone heavy with grief. "But we held the line. We've got to be proud of that." Jonas didn't respond immediately. His gaze drifted to the vast emptiness of space, where the wreckage of the Zitharian ships now floated in the distance. The human fleet was battered and broken, with many ships barely operational. Some were already drifting, their crews lost. The cost of their victory wasn't just in ships, it was in the lives of the men and women who had fought and died to make this moment possible. The reality of what had been lost weighed heavily on Jonas's heart. Bonner had been one of his closest allies in the fight. The soldier had been with him through thick and thin, from the first skirmishes to the final battle. His death had been a painful blow, one Jonas would carry with him forever. The ship's intercom crackled again, and Jonas's eyes flickered to the screen. It was a message from command, a report on the damage to the fleet. "Captain Jonas, we've got the Zitharians on the run, but the war is far from over. We need to regroup and prepare for their next move. We can't let our guard down now." Jonas nodded, though there was no one there to see it. The war was far from over. They had won this battle, but the Zitharians were a relentless enemy. They would regroup, rebuild, and come back stronger. But for now, they had a moment to honor the sacrifice of the fallen, to remember what they had fought for. The pain of loss settled over Jonas like a heavy cloak. He thought of Bonner, of the brave men and women who had given their lives for this victory. The faces of those who had fallen flashed in his mind, their smiles, their determination, their unwavering loyalty. They had believed in this fight. They had believed in humanity's future, and they had given everything to ensure that future. "Bonner would have wanted us to keep going," Harding said, as if reading Jonas's thoughts. Her voice was steady, but Jonas could hear the sorrow in her words. "He wouldn't want us to mourn forever. We have to keep fighting. For him, for everyone." Jonas didn't answer right away. His eyes were still on the wreckage of the Zitharian ships. The debris was a stark reminder of how much had been lost, but also a symbol of what they had accomplished. They had stood their ground, faced down an enemy that outclassed them in every way, and they had won. "We owe them this," Jonas said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "We owe them everything." He closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his thoughts. There was so much more to be done. The war wasn't over. There were more battles to fight, more sacrifices to be made. But for now, the human fleet had secured a victory, a hard-won, painful victory. "Captain, we're receiving a transmission from the Zitharian command," Harding said, her voice sharp. "It's a surrender message." Jonas sat up straighter in his seat, his eyes narrowing. A surrender? After all the destruction, after all the bloodshed, the Zitharians were ready to give up. "Patch it through," Jonas ordered, his voice cold. The screen flickered to life, and a Zitharian officer appeared on the screen. He was battered, his uniform torn, but there was a grudging respect in his eyes. We acknowledge your strength, human," the officer said, his voice tinged with a mix of defeat and admiration. "We underestimated you. The war is over." Jonas stared at the officer, his mind racing. It was hard to believe. The Zitharians had always been so confident, so sure of their superiority. And now, after everything they had done to humanity, they were surrendering. "The war is over," Jonas repeated, his voice hoarse. "Just like that." The officer nodded. "We've lost too many ships. Our forces are scattered. We cannot continue this fight. We surrender." Jonas felt a rush of emotions, relief, disbelief, and a deep sadness for all that had been lost. The Zitharians had finally been beaten, but it had cost humanity so much. The victory was bittersweet. They had won, but they had paid a heavy price. "Understood," Jonas said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. "We'll accept your surrender. But remember this, Zitharian. You will never forget what humanity is capable of." The officer gave a slight bow before the transmission ended, leaving Jonas in a quiet cockpit. The war was over, but it wasn't a celebration. It was a moment of mourning for those who had fallen. Bonner, Harding's friends, so many others. They had fought, they had sacrificed, and in the end, they had given humanity a chance at survival. Jonas closed his eyes again, remembering the fallen. He knew that their legacy would live on, that their sacrifices would never be forgotten. But the victory, the final triumph over the Zitharians, would be forever marked by the faces of those they had lost. It was a victory built on sacrifice, a victory that, in the end, belonged to them all.